July 2, 1917. The sun was setting over East Street, Louis, Illinois, casting a mysterious glow on the Mississippi River. The air was thick with smoke, the streets littered with shattered glass, and the cries of the dying echoed through the winds of the night. Black families clustered together in their burning homes, praying for a miracle that never came. White mobs who were armed roamed the streets with rifles, clubs, and torches, hunting black men, women, and even children. They dragged innocent people from their homes, beat them to death, or shot them on sight. Some victims were thrown off bridges into the Mississippi River, their screams fading beneath the cold current. Others were burned alive while the police and National Guard stood by, some even joining in. The streets of East Street, Louis had become a battlefield, but this was no war. It was an absolute destruction. But how did this happen? How did a city that was thriving with industry and booming with opportunity crumble into one of the deadliest racial massacres in American history? And more importantly, why have so many people never heard of it? Today, when we talk about racial violence in America, most people remember the Tulsa Massacre of 1921. But before Tulsa burned, East St. Louis bled. And what happened in this city would set the stage for a nationwide explosion of racial terror, one that would continue for decades. For us to understand what happened in East St. Louis, let's step back and look at the conditions that led up to that fateful summer. The early 1900s saw a massive migration of black families from the south to the north, seeking better jobs, freedom from racial terror, and a chance to live a new life. Many found work in the industrial cities of the Midwest, including East St. Louis. Louis, where steel mills, meatpacking plants, and railroads were booming. But while these opportunities came, resentment tagged along. A large number of white workers who struggled to keep their jobs saw the influx of black laborers as a direct threat. Tensions began to rise, and all it took was a spark to set the city ablaze. That spark came in the form of vicious newspaper articles spreading lies about black men attacking white women, which happened to be one of the oldest racist tropes used to justify violence. It came through whispered rumors that black workers were driving down wages, taking jobs away from white families. It came through the unchecked rage of white mobs who saw themselves as enforcers of a racial order they refused to let go of. During the summer of 1917, East Street, Louis was a city on the edge. The streets were tense, filled with anger and paranoia. Then one night, a single act of violence triggered an all-out massacre. Sit tight. In the next few minutes, we are going to uncover the truth about this forgotten tragedy. What happened? Let's go through the events of July 1917, where thousands of black residents were hunted like animals. Their homes were burned down. Their lives were stolen in a storm of unchecked racial hatred. We will expose the role of the police, the media, and the government in allowing, if not encouraging, this massacre to happen. If we don't understand how and why these acts of racial terror happened, history will repeat itself. So buckle up. This is the story of the East St. Louis Massacre, the deadly 1917 riot that America tried to erase. The year is 1917. The world is at war, and America's industrial machine is in full swing. Factories across the country hum with the sound of production, feeding the ever-growing demand for steel, coal, meatpacking, and railroads. In the heart of this industrial boom is East Street, Louis, Illinois, a city bubbling at the seams with opportunity and tension. East Street, Louis was not a sleepy Midwestern town. It was a city fueled by sweat, fire, and steel. The Industrial Revolution transformed it into a powerhouse of manufacturing, which attracted workers from across the country. The Illinois Central Railroad roared through the city, linking it to major hubs of commerce. Factories belched thick smoke into the air, turning the sky into a hazy canvas of progress and pollution. The city's industrial landscape was thriving so much that a person who steps in for the first time could get a job under 24 hours. The economy was booming, but it came at a cost. The city's rapid expansion had brought in thousands of workers who were seeking a better life. Among them were African Americans from the Deep South, men and women who were escaping the clutches of Jim Crow laws, fleeing the terror of lynch mobs, and hoping to find dignity in honest labor. But what they found in East Street Louis was a different kind of hostility, one rooted not just in race, but in economic survival. Between 1910 and 1920, over 1 million black Southerners left their homes, embarking on what would later be called the Great Migration. It was one of the most significant demographic shifts in American history. Many set their sights on industrial cities like Chicago, Detroit, and East St. Louis. These cities held the promise of steady wages and an escape from the shackles of the sharecropping system that had kept black families in perpetual poverty. For East Street Louis, the rate at which black workers came in was both a blessing and a curse. The city's industries thrived on cheap labor, and factory owners welcomed black workers with open arms, not out of goodwill, but because they could pay them less than their fellow whites. The use of black workers as strikebreakers further deepened the resentment among white laborers, who saw them as a direct threat to their economic survival. Unions that were dominated by white workers refused to admit black laborers, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation. While white workers could strike for better wages and working conditions, black workers were often forced to cross picket lines, not out of choice but out of necessity and desperation to survive. They needed jobs, and the factory owners needed leverage. It was a recipe for disaster, brewing tensions that would soon explode into violence. Despite their contributions to the city's economy, black residents were not welcomed as equals. East Street Louis was deeply segregated, both by law and by custom. Black families were confined to overcrowded, poorly maintained neighborhoods on the borders of the city. Schools were separate and underfunded. Businesses rarely served black customers, and when they did, it was under strict rules of racial hierarchy. The racial divide was not just a social act, it was enforced by violence. Black residents knew there were places they could not go after sundown, and streets they could not walk without risking their lives. Police often turned a blind eye, or worse, participated in the intimidation. The city government, which was controlled by white elites, had little interest in protecting its black citizens. For black workers, the dangers were not just in the streets, but in the very places they labored. They were assigned the most dangerous jobs in factories and slaughterhouses to work in conditions that white workers refused to endure. If they were injured or killed on the job, their families received little to no compensation. They were expendable in the eyes of the industrialists who profited from their labor. While economic competition played a major role in racial tensions, the media amplified it. Newspapers, especially those that focused on white audiences, regularly printed inflammatory stories about black crime that were often exaggerated or outrightly fabricated. These stories fueled white fears and reinforced the idea that black migration brought not just economic competition, but moral decay. Rumors of black men assaulting white women became a common tool to incite racial hatred, despite little to no evidence supporting these claims. White mobs often used these allegations as justification for violence. This was a pattern that had been seen throughout the South and was now taking root in the North. Politicians who were desperate to maintain their power played into these fears. They painted black workers as outsiders, disrupting the social order. The factory owners, however, remained silent. As long as production continued, they cared little about the racial powder keg building in their city. However, some people stated that there were some early signs that the massacre was coming. The first signs of large-scale violence came in April 1917. White laborers, already feeling squeezed by rising black employment, staged strikes. The resentment in the air was thick, and it needed just a spark to ignite. That spark came when reports circulated that more black workers were being brought in to replace striking white employees. On April 5th, an angry mob of white workers stormed through black neighborhoods, randomly attacking residents. Homes were vandalized and burnt down, and businesses looted. The police made only half-hearted attempts to stop the violence, arresting as many black victims as white aggressors. This was a prelude to something far worse. For black residents, the message was clear: their presence in East St. Louis was tolerated only as long as they remained silent, invisible, and submissive. But silence would not save them when the true storm arrived just a few months later. By June 1917, the situation had reached a boiling point. White workers were organizing, whispering about plans to drive black residents out of the city for good. Politicians did nothing to intervene, and the police seemed either unconcerned or complicit. All it took was one incident, one misunderstanding to set the city ablaze. That moment came on July 1st, when gunfire rang out in a black neighborhood. A car filled with white men had been patrolling the area, allegedly shooting into homes. Black residents who were weary of constant threats fired back. But in the chaos, 2 white policemen in plain clothes were mistakenly killed. The news spread like wildfire, and within hours, mobs of white men gathered, armed and ready to unleash terror. What followed was one of the most brutal massacres in American history. The streets of East Street. Lewis were soaked in blood. Black families were burned alive in their homes. Men, women, and children were lynched in broad daylight, and the world watched in horror as a city descended into an orgy of racial violence. But before we dive into this bloodbath, we must ask, how did a city filled with so much promise become a slaughterhouse? How did a place of opportunity turn into a nightmare for black residents? And why was nothing done to stop it? By 1917, East Street. Lewis was a city that was struggling on the edge of chaos. The city was bustling with industrial growth, its steel mills, meatpacking plants, and rail yards humming with activity. But beneath the surface of economic prosperity, the Great Migration had brought thousands of black Southerners to the city, who hoped for freedom from the terror of the Jim Crow South. Instead, they found themselves walking into a boiling cauldron of resentment, white rage, and unchecked racial animosity. For years, white workers had controlled the labor force in East St. Louis. But now, industries were hiring black workers in droves, often using them to break strikes or replace white employees demanding better wages. This shift created a dangerous dynamic that exploded into one of the most horrific racial massacres in American history. In early 1917, white workers in East St. Louis began to realize that their monopoly over industry was slipping. They had long enjoyed a position of dominance in the workforce, but with black migration increasing, their sense of economic security was crumbling. The trigger came in May 1917 when white workers from the Aluminum Ore Company went on strike, demanding higher wages. The company responded not by negotiating, but by bringing in black workers to replace them. To white workers, this was an unforgivable betrayal. Suddenly, the black workers were no longer just newcomers, they became threats. They were seen as people who would work for lower wages, who would never unionize, and who, in the eyes of white workers, were stealing jobs. The resentment festered, and rumors like, "The Negroes are coming for all our jobs. They're taking over our city, and if we don't stop them now, East St. Louis will be theirs," spread like wildfire. Soon, anger turned to action. White workers began to form groups, some directly tied to labor unions, others informal mobs intent on driving black workers out of the city. Employers fanned the flames, preferring a racially divided workforce that would never unify against them. And so, in the streets, in bars and factories, the seeds of violence were sown. As economic tensions escalated, newspapers in East St. Louis played their sinister role in the lead-up to the massacre. Instead of calming tensions, they did the opposite. They poured fuel on the fire. Sensationalized headlines painted black workers as criminals, troublemakers, and aggressors. Reports of imaginary black-on-white violence were published without evidence. White readers, already angry about job losses, now saw black residents as a physical threat to their safety. Some newspapers even suggested that black men were preying on white women. This was a common racist trope used to justify racial violence throughout American history. The influence of the press cannot be overstated. These false narratives turned suspicion into fear, fear into hatred, and hatred into action. In one controversial editorial published in a local paper just weeks before the massacre, an anonymous writer warned, "East Street. Louis is being overrun. If something is not done soon, we will lose our homes, our jobs, and our families. Will we stand idly by, or will we act?" I guess the message was clear. The tension was no longer just whispers and resentment, it was about to spill into the streets. The first major outbreak of racial violence struck East St. Louis happened in April of 1917, when white mobs, provoked by the hiring of black workers, launched a violent rampage through black neighborhoods. Homes were set on fire, windows smashed, and black residents were attacked at random. The violence was shocking, but it was only a taste of what was to come. Instead of local authorities cracking down on the white rioters, they made little effort to stop them. Some even sympathized with the mob, believing that black workers needed to be kept in their place. This became a clear message: white violence would go unpunished. The April attack left black residents terrified, but also determined to defend themselves. Many armed themselves, refusing to be victims without a fight. This decision, one of sheer survival, was later twisted into a false narrative of black aggression, giving white mobs the justification they needed for a full-scale massacre. Towards late June 1917, East Street. Louis became a heated city on the edge. Every bar, factory, and street corner was buzzing with white paranoia. The false narratives of black crime, economic takeover, and aggression had gotten out of hand. That was when the final spark occurred. Back to the night of July 1st, 1917, when a car full of white men drove into a black neighborhood and began firing shots into the streets. Some accounts suggest they were off-duty police officers. Others claim they were civilians looking for trouble. What is certain is that the attack sent shockwaves through the black community. After the black residents took defensive positions out of fear of another massacre like the one in April, another car approached. They assumed it was another attack, so they opened fire. Tragically, the occupants of this car were two plainclothes police officers, and both were killed. This was the moment White East Street, Louis, had been waiting for. News of the police death spread instantly, and white mobs began to form. Hundreds of white men gathered overnight preparing for war, which was fueled by rage, racism, and the belief that they had been given a reason to retaliate. The immediate causes of the East St. Louis race riot were not random. They were not the result of spontaneous anger or coincidental clashes. They were the product of systemic racism, economic manipulation, media-driven hysteria, and unchecked white violence. From labor disputes to racist propaganda, every factor had been deliberately pushing the city toward disaster. And when the first gunshots rang out on July 1st, the floodgates were opened. White mobs burned down entire black neighborhoods to the ground, lynched men in broad daylight, and forced women and children into the Mississippi River. Instead of the National Guard to protect black residents, they either remained idle and watched or actively participated in the slaughter. This was not just a riot, it was a racial pogrom, a targeted, coordinated act of terror against an entire black community. The night of July 1st, 1917, was like any other in the black neighborhoods of East St. Louis until this incident made the air thick. This was no random act of violence. It was a warning. It was a threat. And it was received loud and clear. The narrative was flipped instantly. No mention was made of the first round of gunfire that had terrorized black neighborhoods. No one spoke of the white men who had provoked the situation. Instead, newspapers and white citizens latched onto a singular message. The Negroes have declared war on the city. They must be stopped. At that moment, the truth no longer mattered. What mattered was revenge. On the morning of July 2nd, white anger had reached its boiling point. Rumors, exaggerations, half-truths, and outright lies that were designed to fuel white rage spread like an uncontrollable wildfire. Stories circulated that black men were arming themselves for an uprising, that they had killed white women and children, and that they were preparing to burn the city down. It was all false, but in 1917, facts didn't matter when it came to race. By midday, hundreds of white men began gathering in downtown East St. Louis, their numbers swelling by the hour. The police were fully aware of what was happening, but instead of stopping them, they let it happen. In some cases, officers actively encouraged white citizens to take matters into their own hands. Get rid of them. Make sure they never come back. This is your city. Take it back. These were the whispers passing from white officials to the growing mob. The atmosphere was electrified with pure hatred. White men armed themselves with guns, clubs, knives, and torches. Some gathered in saloons drinking heavily before heading to the streets. Others looted hardware stores, taking whatever weapons they could find. The National Guard, which had been deployed in response to earlier tensions, stood by and watched, many of them sympathetic to the mob's cause. By the afternoon, the white mob was ready for war. Then they attacked. The first wave of violence began in the Black Business District. White rioters stormed into stores that were owned by, smashing windows, overturning shelves, and setting buildings on fire. Black store owners who tried to defend their livelihoods were beaten mercilessly. Some were lynched on the spot. Within minutes, smoke filled the air. Then the mob turned their attention to the black residential neighborhoods. White rioters, now in the thousands, poured into black communities. They set homes ablaze, one by one, forcing families to flee into the streets where they were met with merciless violence. Black men were dragged from their homes and beaten to death. Black women were assaulted in the streets, their screams drowned out by the mob's cheers. Black children, terrified and confused, ran in every direction, some into the Mississippi River where they drowned trying to escape. The city was burning. Black residents who tried to fight back were outnumbered in a ratio of 10 to 1, which made it impossible to fight back. The mob showed no mercy. Entire families were massacred, and their bodies were left in the streets as warnings to anyone who dared to resist. One survivor later recalled, "They burned our homes with people still inside. I saw men laughing as they threw gasoline on houses, knowing women and babies were inside. They wanted us gone. They wanted us dead." The violence began to spread block by block. Black workers who had not even heard about the initial shooting were targeted at random. Men walking home from work were gunned down. Mothers carrying their children were beaten in broad daylight. By nightfall, East Street Lewis had descended into pure destruction. One of the most horrifying aspects of the massacre was the role of law enforcement. Instead of stopping the violence, police officers joined in and took part in orchestrating evil. Some stood by as black residents were murdered, refusing to intervene. Others actively helped the rioters, directing them to black homes and businesses. The National Guards who were deployed in the city did almost nothing to protect black citizens. Some guardsmen were later reported to have fired into black crowds instead of stopping white attackers. One white officer, when asked why he wasn't arresting rioters, responded bluntly, saying, "We're cleaning up the city." Then the message was clear. This was beyond just a riot. It was a racial purge. As black families ran for their lives, white mobs continued their rampage, ensuring no black person in East St. Louis would feel safe again. This was not just a spontaneous riot. It was a carefully coordinated racial terror, an organized slaughter that was designed to wipe out an entire black community. And the worst part, it was far from over. As the fires continued to burn and the bodies piled up in the streets, the massacre was still only yet to begin. In the next 24 hours, even more horrors unfolded. Black residents who sought refuge in the Mississippi River were shot down by white mobs who were waiting along the shore. Pregnant black women were beaten and left dead. White citizens and entire families, including women and children, gathered to watch the slaughter as if it were entertainment. The worst of the East Street Louis race massacre was still ahead. As night fell on July 2, 1917, the streets of East St. Louis became an open-air slaughterhouse. The white mobs were no longer just rioting, they were hunting. They stormed through black neighborhoods like wild animals, attacking anyone in sight. No one was spared. Men, women, children, the elderly. Even the disabled were prey. Many black residents had nowhere to run to. Their homes were already on fire, their streets filled with gunmen, lynch mobs, and police who either stood by or joined in the massacre. The violence became unimaginable. One of the most horrific tactics used by the white mobs was burning black people alive. Mobs torched homes, businesses, and churches, knowing that entire families were still inside. Survivors later described horrific scenes of people screaming inside burning houses, their voices eventually fading into silence as the flames consumed them. One witness recalled, "I saw a man run out of his house, covered in flames. He was screaming, trying to put the fire out with his hands. The mob just laughed as he collapsed, burning to death in the street." Another black family was trapped inside their home as it burned. The father desperately tried to escape, carrying his 2 children. Before he could even step outside, white men shot him in the head. His lifeless body fell back into the flames, his children still in his arms. The cruelty knew no bounds. Some black residents tried to escape on foot, only to be chased down and murdered in the open streets. They shot them down like they were animals. One survivor, a young black girl at the time, recalled watching her father and older brother trying to flee. They ran as fast as they could, but the white men had horses and they caught them. I heard gunshots and then I saw them fall. I never saw them again. Black men were hanged from telephone poles and lampposts, their bodies left as gruesome warnings. Some were lynched on the spot, their bodies were dragged through the streets like trophies. I saw a group of white men tying a rope around a black man's neck. They lifted him above a streetlight and set his body on fire. They cheered like it was a sport. Some black families tried to escape by boat, believing they could find safety across the Mississippi River. Little did they know that white men were waiting for them. Armed with rifles and shotguns, white vigilantes lined the riverbanks, picking off black refugees one by one. They waited until people got into the water. Then they started shooting. We saw people drowning, their bodies floating down the river. Some black men and women drowned under the weight of their terror, dragged down by the bodies of their children, who they had tried to carry to safety. Even those who made it across the river found no salvation. White mobs in St. Louis, Missouri, stood ready with clubs, bats, and guns, ensuring that no black person would find safety on either side of the river. Survivors of the massacre later gave chilling testimony about what they witnessed. One man who barely escaped recalled, saying, "I saw white men laughing while beating a black woman to death. They took turns hitting her with iron pipes until she stopped moving. Then they left her body in the street like garbage." A black nurse who tried to help the wounded described the horror of the massacre. In her words, "There were dead bodies everywhere. Some burned, some shot, some beaten so badly you couldn't even tell who they were. It smelled like death." Another survivor, a young black boy, later testified, "I saw white men drag a pregnant black woman from her house. They stabbed her in the stomach and left her bleeding in the street. I was just a boy, but I knew they wanted to kill all of us." The streets of East Street. Louis were painted with blood, and yet no one was coming to stop it. While black men, women, and children were being slaughtered, the East St. Louis Police and National Guard did nothing. They even helped in accomplishing this massacre. Many white officers joined rioters instead of arresting them. Some handed out guns and ammunition to white mobs, ensuring they could continue their killing spree. Others pointed out black homes and businesses, showing rioters where to attack next. As if that wasn't enough, some officers even fired their weapons into black crowds, treating the massacre like a hunting trip. One black survivor, hiding in a basement, said, "I saw a police officer walk up to a wounded black man. He wasn't dead yet, he was lying on the ground, bleeding. The officer pulled out his gun and shot him in the head. Then he walked away like nothing happened." The National Guard had been deployed to restore order. But instead, they stood shoulder to shoulder with the rioters, watching as innocent black residents were killed. They stood there, arms folded, while we were being butchered, some survivors recounted. Some guardsmen were later caught looting black homes, stealing what little possessions families had left behind in the chaos. When black residents tried to defend themselves, the response from authorities was swift and brutal. Many black men took up arms to protect their families, but as soon as they did, they became criminals. A white man could kill a black man with no consequence, but the moment the black man tried to fight back, he was the one arrested. White rioters walked free, even when caught red-handed in acts of murder and deliberately starting a fire to cause damage. Black residents were thrown in jail for simply trying to defend themselves. Black men were shot on sight just for carrying weapons. The courts later made it clear that it was not the rioters who were punished, but was the survivors. By July 3, 1917, the massacre had escalated to its peak. Entire black neighborhoods were gone, reduced to ash and rubble. Hundreds of black families were now homeless. Those who survived had lost everything. Government reports later estimated 100 black people were killed, but survivors insisted the true death toll was much higher. They didn't count the bodies they threw in the river. They didn't count the people burned inside their homes. They didn't count the ones buried in mass graves. The East Street Louis Race Massacre was not just an attack. It was an attempt to erase an entire black community. And the worst part, the government, the police, and white society let it happen. As the fires smoldered and the blood dried in the streets, the country reacted in shock. But would justice ever come? Though the East Street Louis Race Massacre may have ended, its impact would last for generations. The fires had stopped burning, the screams had faded, the mobs had returned home, wiping the blood from their hands as if nothing had happened. But East Street Louis would never be the same again. The once thriving black community now lay in smoldering ruins, its people scattered, wounded, and grieving. The massacre had destroyed more than just lives and buildings. It had crushed the spirit of an entire community. Those who survived no longer had homes to return to. Their possessions had been stolen, burned, or left buried. Bodies still lay in the streets, while some floating in the Mississippi River, others buried hastily in mass graves, graves that, to this day, have never been fully accounted for. For the survivors, the question was no longer, how do we rebuild? But rather, can we even survive? Official reports downplayed the violence, claiming only 39 black people were killed, a number that survivors and journalists at the time called a blatant lie. A witness even testified of seeing more than that number. Opinions recorded that the real death toll estimates range from 100 to 250 black victims, but we will never truly know. The whites saw the massacre as an unfortunate incident, not a crime. Meanwhile, it was a genocide. One of the tragic happenings of these moments was that they were still surrounded by the same white people who had tried to kill them. Towards the end of 1917, thousands of black residents had packed their belongings and fled East St. Louis forever. Some moved north to cities like Chicago and Detroit, hoping to find safety and better opportunities. Others joined the growing black migration to Harlem, becoming part of a movement that would later fuel the Harlem Renaissance. W.E.B. Du Bois led a massive silent protest parade in New York City, where about 10,000 black people marched in total silence to mourn the victims. Even though white society tried to erase the East St. Louis massacre, its impact was felt for generations. It hardened black resistance, fueling the rise of the NAACP and other civil rights movements. It radicalized black leaders, who realized that America's racial violence was not an accident, but a system, and also inspired future black activists like Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party, who saw the massacre as proof that self-defense was necessary. For those who survived, the trauma never faded. For those who fled, the scars traveled with them. And for America as a whole, the massacre exposed an undeniable truth that even decades after the Civil War, black people in this country were still not safe. But the impact of the massacre went beyond East Street Louis. It shaped black resistance, fueled the civil rights movement, and exposed the deep-rooted racial violence that America refused to acknowledge. And in many ways, we are still living with its consequences today. This trauma didn't disappear. It passed from one generation to the next, embedding itself into the very fabric of black American life. For decades, black parents taught their children to fear and survive. They'll say to them, "Don't talk back to white folks or you'll get killed. Don't build too much or they'll burn it down. And don't trust the police because they don't work for us." This fear wasn't paranoia. It was reality. The massacre planted seeds of generational trauma that shaped Black identity, Black activism, and Black survival strategies for decades. America tried to erase the memory of East Street. Louis for decades. No national memorials, no government apologies, no justice for the victims. But we refuse to forget. Because history is not just about the past. It's about the future we choose to build. And if we want to break this cycle of racial violence, we must fight for the truth, no matter how painful it is. The massacre was a message, and our message today must be just as clear. We will remember, we will tell the truth, and we will never let history repeat itself. Like and subscribe for more documentaries on Black history.